So I'm going to start off with a fairly philosophical position and ask you to comment on a variety of principles and ideas, and then we can take the discussion further, if you don't mind. And I'd like to begin actually with the submission that you've made. And I don't know if we've got it on screen, but do you have a copy in front of you? Or do you
No, but I remember it.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. We can maybe bring it up on page 6. You spend a little bit of time, a little bit of space, I beg your pardon, in your submission, talking about the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
This, going back to Milton and Oliver Wendell Holmes and a number of legal experts in the United States, and you make the argument that the marketplace of ideas is, if I can quote your words, is constantly quoted in debates on free speech without any detailed definition or explanation as to how it is deemed to work its wonders. And the next paragraph, you state, the theory leads to at least 2 analytical misapprehensions, since it implies that not only will the best ideas survive, and you've emphasized that, but also the best technology. So you have, in your submission, detailed a number of concerns that you have about using the marketplace of ideas as a conceptual framework to analyze what we should do in this space, as well as to defend or criticize the various options. If I could go on, you explain that the tech companies are not at the mercy of the marketplace, they control the marketplace. Their dominance will not be curtailed by market forces, and certainly not as a consequence of a restricted number of potential users, arguably limiting growth. So you've taken quite a strong stance that the marketplace of ideas is flawed and perhaps not the right way to think about some of these issues. Then you go on and you've numbered these issues of 1 and 2, which is item 2, which is now on the 7th page. Your second line, the average, I presume, cost ratio, probably a typo there, the average cost ratio of compliance to revenue in the finance industry is substantial, and this is one of the real reasons why accountability is rejected, not the promotion of free speech and democratic values. So 2 major criticisms of why the marketplace of ideas is a problem. One is, the second one, the financial incentives that are present in this space. And the first is that structurally, some of the opportunities for the operations of the marketplace of ideas to do its work its wonders, in your words, not quite present. Perhaps we could start with, if there's a further commentary you'd like to apply to this issue that you've put in your submission, and then we can take it from there.
Well, thank you. Yes, indeed. Well, first of all, I'd like to commend the initiative of the government of Singapore to create this hearing. It's, as far as I know, it's the first ever to call in experts from all over the world. And it really demonstrates the seriousness of this country in arriving at the right solution and striking the right balance between different values, of course, freedom of speech being one of them, which would bring me to the marketplace of ideas. So, well done, bravo. I salute this initiative. In terms of the marketplace of ideas, I realize that what I represent by my submission is controversial. And of course, I did that more or less deliberately, because the marketplace of ideas has become more or less a politically correct statement, a politically correct philosophy. And well, my philosophy is quite the opposite. When something is politically correct, I always try and challenge it. I think that one should, as a matter of principle. And the marketplace of idea, you see, let me rephrase that. The problem with metaphors is that metaphors, they hijack, or they have a tendency to hijack rational thought. This was something that was pointed out already, if we talk about law, in the Nuremberg trials, where the notion of venomous or poisonous thought and challenges was introduced in terms of the analysis of hate speech, that it was like poison. And of course, that leaves out a lot of aspects which do not stand up to further analysis. The problem is with all metaphors, again, that they become too general in scope and that they become self-fulfilling. The marketplace of ideas is such a metaphor. It presupposes that there is a real debate, that there is kind of like an intellectual jousting, and that somebody will decide which idea is the best and which idea will win. It's almost Darwinistic. And of course, ideas are in no way subject to Darwinistic criteria of truth. And in addition to that, the problem in this when we talk about technology is that if the marketplace is controlled the way it is today, then there is no marketplace. So my two observations is, first of all, that conflicting ideas are not judged by some Darwinistic method, which the metaphor implies. And the second thing is that the marketplace as such does not exist today on the internet in general. And that is the real problem. The concentration of information does not allow, even if arguably there was a marketplace, it doesn't allow this marketplace to exist.
Thank you. You then go on in your submission. So I think the first portion and what you just said argues that either the marketplace as envisioned does not exist, or the marketplace, if it exists, in its operations is significantly flawed. You then go on to talk about the potential of regulation in this space in your submission. And then I think on the basis that you are saying that, well, if people are defending the status quo on the basis that the marketplace of ideas is there, what shall we do from a regulatory point of view? Am I right to characterize your submission that way? Yes.
Yep.
So you then go on to say about maybe 1/3 of the way down the page, the real marketplace is, however, far from unregulated. And I quote, even in the most liberal of societies do we find regulations of the marketplace, and one of the best examples is that of antitrust. If the marketplace, i.e. the interaction between free economic agents, would regulate itself so that the best commodity idea will survive, why introduce antitrust regulation? Obviously, the marketplace is distorted if there's no free exchange of commodities. So you are drawing the parallel then that in real-world marketplaces, we need some degree of regulation to ensure that it operates. So if we say that it's flawed, you have a parallel there, or we could make the argument that it doesn't even exist. Now, then you then go on to say, from a historic perspective, however, the debate was heated when the first instances of governmental intervention to liberate the economy from monopolization were introduced. Quite fiery words here if you have some historical people in the room or some economists, but essentially I think you are making the case that when these types of issues were tested with respect to commodities, to finances, there was the same argument against regulation, that somehow this would reduce the liberal flow of those real goods. The same arguments were offered, and in the end we ended up having to regulate these spaces to, as you, in your words, and I like this phrase, liberate the economy from monopolization. Is that the parallel you're trying to draw? Am I?
Absolutely. I mean, you're perfectly right. And it's not a coincidence that I refer to antitrust as one of the areas where we see that in order to arrive at true competition, we have to regulate competition, which of course is one of the problems that we are dealing with in terms of deliberate falsehoods is again also, and I think that we'll make the bridge to that, is of course also the concentration of information. And that's why I mentioned antitrust.
Thank you. So I'm going to quote you a certain passage. I think it sums up where we are, but it's your words, so you will recognize the quote. But for the purposes of the record and other members of the committee. Society and consumers, this is on the same page, the end of the page, society and consumers end up paying the price. there is no need to justify antitrust regulations. It seems obvious to us today that a marketplace cannot exist without such regulations. Failure to regulate leads to a restriction of liberty, not to the opposite. Even the staunchest supporters of the free market, which seem to be the theoretical foundation of the marketplace of ideas, would not argue against a certain level of environmental protection, consumer protection, antitrust, financial regulations, product liability, etc. Actually, the marketplace of ideas, far from justifying the absence of regulation, demonstrates exactly the opposite, the need to protect values through regulation. And it is this last bit that I'm most interested in at this point. Would you like to expand on this idea that you need to protect values through regulation in order to have a functioning marketplace of ideas?
Well, let's relate it to the problem that we are dealing with here. Again, let me just, as a preliminary remark, say that I love the expression deliberate falsehoods. I think that it's a much better expression than fake news. I'll get to answer your remark, but I just wanted to make this preliminary remark. Falsehoods is much more generic than news. On the other hand, deliberate presupposes an element of intention, which I'll get back to in a second. Clearly, the need to, as a consequence of concentration, and not only concentration over the infrastructure, that is concentration of search engines and social media in general, but also of the ability through technology, and here I'm thinking especially bots, to disseminate false information for those that are adamant on doing so. As a consequence of that, we find that unfortunately, we are, as human beings, very prone to believe what is sensational, what is scandalous, and we are more easily manipulated into believing what is negative than what is positive. I know that because I've been working with quite a lot of psychologists and sociologists and the work I'm doing on fake news in general in France. And as a consequence of that, we need to be very, very careful that the necessary balance is made so that the counter narrative, as it's called, will actually be heard and will be understood. The only way that we can achieve that is through regulation. So that, I hope, answers your question if we relate it directly to the problem at hand.
And you make a comment on the next page, and I think this is in the context about the survival of the fittest axiom. And I think you begin the frame by saying that the virality of content has no bearing on its validity. Market participation or dominance is not a pertinent criterion of truth or intrinsic societal value. And then you go on a little bit further, 3 paragraphs later, it has no consensual measure of value. So there is a marketplace of ideas, but it may not be functioning as a market, and it may be a poor proxy for truth, and your position is that part of that is because we don't have a consensus of what counts for value in what is happening in this online space.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. Which is again, therefore, an argument for regulation.
An argument for regulation. Okay. Okay. If I could just divert your attention to some of the submissions, not submissions, I beg your pardon, some of the commentary that has been made on some of these issues from a number of other people. We'll return to your submission and some of the things that we are having to consider. I've just got 2 articles that I want to show you. You may or may not have had a chance to familiarize yourself with them. You may not be familiar with. The first is from The Guardian by Andrew Rawnsley, published on the 25th of March. And the title, Politicians Can't Control the Digital Giants with Rules Drawn Up for the Analog Era. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this piece of work, but I'm going to quote a few things and ask for your commentary. about whether you think these are valid statements and whether it has an impact on what we should do. And I quote, politicians have gnashed their teeth about tax. I'm sorry, I've lost my... gnashed their teeth about the tech giants' reluctance to pay tax, but flailed about trying to find a remedy. Politicians have wailed about extremist, harmful, and illegal content on the internet, but hesitated to legislate and lamely implored the platforms to implement their own technical solution. The tech barons have largely been left to set their own rules. They have been allowed a degree of self-policing which society would never tolerate for car makers or drugs manufacturers. That's a very strong statement, but do you think the author has hit the nail on the head, or?
Well, it could have been me.
Oh, is that right? So you would agree with this position?
Absolutely. I'd certainly like to meet that person.
Okay, Andrew Rawnsley is his name.
Okay.
Then later on, it talks about some of the levers that are present. The author is talking particularly about Britain. It says, Britain's data protection regulator. This is the paragraph that begins, invigilation is a particular weakness in Britain. Britain's, there you go. And about halfway through, Britain's data protection regulator is the Information Commissioner. Her powers are so feeble that it took nearly a week to get her team through the front door of Cambridge Analytica. Let us just say that this is rather longer than it takes to press delete. The Information Commissioner and the Electoral Commission, both bodies set up for an entirely different technological landscape, are underpowered and under-resourced. There are rising and cross-party demands for a toughening up of the data protection bill now going through the Commons. One modest step would be to add criminal penalties for companies which fail to comply with disclosure orders. Something close to your heart, or how do you feel about this statement?
I actually met Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner, in Manchester. That was back in July. It is true that the different data protection agencies in Europe, and I talk about Europe here as the European Union, the 28 countries, soon 27, unfortunately. They may be understaffed. The General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into effect on the 25th of May, which is very soon, has caused a lot of these DPA, these data protection agencies, to try and beef up their ability to implement and enforce the very heavy fines. As you know, 4% of global turnover will be the fines that will be levied after the 21st of May in Europe. And it is indeed a problem getting the necessary qualified staff in place, not only for the DPAs but also for the corporations that are looking for these people. I would say, fortunately, the sanctions, as I mentioned before, 4% of global turnover is quite hefty. It will give the General Data Protection Regulation and the European authorities much more power. Talking about the other remark, which was that yes, it seems that the European Union has been focused very much on tax. That is true. One does not exclude the other, fortunately. You may have followed this news that the latest proposal from the European Commission is now to levy a turnover-based tax of 3%. We may talk about that later if you so desire. I don't think it's the subject of today's hearing, but a turnover tax of 3% is indeed the proposal on the table of the European Commission. So again, one does not exclude the other. It has been very, very tax-based, but not exclusively. The General Data Protection Regulation has been on the table for 4 years now, and that is going to help quite a lot. We see that the tech giants are already they already accept that this is a fact, and they are already trying to find ways of implementing the General Data Protection Regulation more or less on a global scale, because it will be very, very difficult for them to have one set of rules which apply to 28, soon 27 countries, and another set of rules that applies to the rest of the world. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, will most probably be exported to other countries.
Thank you. And then there are a couple more lines from this article I just want to highlight. I think it may just help us crystallize the type of problem that we're trying to deal with. So the paragraph, the knottiest problem with governing the space is what the internet is doing to democratic politics. If I skip ahead a sentence, it says, what is easier to agree is that the internet has created a political ecosystem in which the extreme, the incendiary, and the polarizing tend to prevail over the considered, the rational, and the consensus-seeking. That again, something that you could quite easily agree with, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I've done quite a lot of work and continuing that on hate speech, security, incitement, and even persecution, harassment, and so on the internet. And it's really frightening what we see. It could ultimately lead not only to harm against the individual and against society, as we see, because deliberate falsehoods may be a great challenge to democracy, but also to stability, not only on a regional but also on a global level.
And you're familiar with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology study about the falsehood spreading 6 times faster than the truth, which the article was quoted. I'm sure that's quite significantly
absolutely. I think one of the main challenges. Actually, I co-chaired a hearing at the Senate in Paris about that was in mid-February together with Facebook, and mentioned Cambridge Analytica, of course, before the story broke out. I think that the next story that will break out, if I may also try and predict that one, will be not MIT, but will be Stanford University. I don't know whether the panel has this information, but Stanford University, in its psychology lab, has developed what they call persuasion points. Now, just listen to this. Each and every one of them in this room, we have 60 persuasion points. All right? So I can, if I have that technology, if I had that information on each and every one of you, I could probably persuade you to do whatever I want. I think this is very, very dangerous. And actually, in terms of deliberate falsehoods, I think that it's much more dangerous to have this kind of science, to have this kind of research, if it falls into the wrong hands, like we saw with Cambridge Analytica. Allowing this research is a problem in itself. Controlling what is done with it is probably the only thing we can do, because prohibiting research would probably be impossible. But I find it very, very dangerous to democracy that we have this kind of ability to identify 60 data points on each and every one of us in order to persuade us to whatever somebody wants us to do. So this is one of the things that I think we should definitely concentrate on. The psychological research. It's been a fact known for many, many years that, for instance, subliminal advertising, just to remind everybody what that is, subliminal advertising is, of course, the fact that when you see a movie, your subconscious will register certain images that you don't consciously register. And that has been outlawed, that has been prohibited in almost all countries around the world. The classic example is that you go in and you watch a movie, and afterwards when you go out, you want to have popcorn or Coke or whatever it is, and you don't realize that this is actually because there was this picture of it, and again you registered without knowing that you registered. That is prohibited. That is not prohibited on the internet. I find it completely unacceptable that we allow this kind of thing on a media which is much more prevalent than the classic broadcasting media and the cinema industry is today. So if I may predict the next scandal, it will be based on the abuse of such psychological research.
And your concern is that such psychological research is ongoing and made easier by the online tools that can be deployed.
Oh yeah, I mean, as we saw in Cambridge Analytica, the information was for sale for the highest bidder. Okay. So this is not theoretical speculation. This unfortunately already happened, and it will happen again.
So this brings me just to the last quote that I want to pull from this Guardian article, which is 2 paragraphs down, there is a persuasive case that this is a profound change to the political ecosystem with considerable potential to subvert the open debate which is critical to democracy. And the next couple of sentences really reinforce what you've just said. In the analog political era, we could all read the promises a party put in its manifesto, we could all see the claims a party made on its roadside billboards, and we could all watch the attacks launched on an opponent in a TV broadcast. That made it possible to call out mendacities and expose contradictions and to hold those responsible to account. This didn't prevent distortion and misinformation, but it was easier to spot and more risky to perpetrate, which I think is very similar to the point that you just
Absolutely.
made.
If I just may address, because you mentioned account, and as I said, I'm also the president of the Association for Accountability and Democracy. The problem we have is, as opposed to classic media, and you talk about the broadcasters here, but of course we have it also in the written press media, is that of accountability. And if given that we have to address this problem, because I think everybody agrees, maybe to a lesser degree or higher degree, that it is a problem to democracy at least. Given that we have to address it, we need to see how can we apply a standard of accountability to these new media. Actually, what I just said here presupposes that they are media. And when I mentioned that word, I didn't do it in the legal sense of the word, but more in the sociological sense of the word. Because unfortunately, they are not categorized as media in law, as you know. So media law does not apply to the tech titans or the tech giants as they are today. Now, why is that the case? And should it remain that way? And if not, is there another way of making them accountable? I think those are the 3 questions. And I'd just like to remind everybody that the basis today for the operations of these companies is not really the First Amendment in the US, it's the Communications Decency Act, Article 230C. I don't know what everybody knows about that section in the Telecommunications Act. It's absolutely key to understand the legal environment. This is the section in U.S. law that creates what I call absolute immunity to the infrastructure providers, and I use the word infrastructure providers because I think it really demonstrates what they are. According to Communications Decency Act 230, they're supposed to be mere conduits, infrastructure providers. They just provide the pipes or the tubes, and they don't have anything to do with content. Now, that might have been true in 1996 when the Communications Decency Act was passed. And, but it's no longer true, in my opinion. It's very interesting that in the European Union, 4 years later, that is in the year 2000, the e-commerce directive, which is still in force and effect in the European Union, in Article 14 and Article 15, have a system of relative immunity, as opposed to the Communications Decency Act, which is absolute immunity. That system of relative immunity actually allows, under European law, to hold the infrastructure providers liable or accountable for content under certain conditions, which again is not possible under American law. And those conditions are today that the content in question has to be manifestly illicit. The word manifestly was introduced pursuant to some constitutional court decisions in France and in Germany that said that you cannot hold an infrastructure provider accountable unless the illegality of the content is manifest. Since there are penal sanctions involved, this has to be the case. I can get back to that in a second, what the practical consequence of that is. But I think it's very important to remember that the point of departure in law is the Communications Decency Act with absolute immunity, and then, of course, in Europe, the relative immunity, and then you have different variations in other countries. Now, let me just give an example how strong the Communications Decency Act actually is in the US. There have been 3 cases, maybe 4 cases now. Against Twitter, there's been 1. Against Facebook, there have been 3. Yeah, so that's 4 cases in total. On anti-terrorist or on terrorist cases. That is to say, victims of terrorist acts have actually taken legal action against Twitter and Facebook for being instrumental in assisting, abating, and so on, terrorist acts to be committed. That is the material support doctrine. Clearly the idea was that infrastructure providers can render material support simply by the infrastructure as such to the commission of such terrorist acts. That's based on the Anti-Terrorist Act. You may have a look at that. It's Article 22, 23, A and B. The interesting thing is that these cases were lost by the victims. They were won by Facebook and Twitter. In other words, even material support has to give way to the Communications Decency Act. This is just to demonstrate to everybody in this room that how important the Communications Decency Act is almost constitutional, it's almost the First Amendment. So this is the problem we have today, that this very, very, very strong protection applies in the US, and since the tech titans are based in the US, the rest of the world has to accept as a fact that whether or not, whatever we do in terms of legislation and regulation will have limited effect, unfortunately. Due to the universal nature, due to the universal character of the internet.
Well, I would interrupt at that point, Mr. Shevit. We've heard some fairly convincing explanations from the tech titans themselves, as well as other technical experts, that actually in practice for a number of years, there has been significant geographical variation of exactly which version of the internet or social media we are presented with. So I think I accept your point, and I hope I understand your point well with respect to the regulatory space and the legislative framework in the United States being an impediment to some of the challenges to free speech on the basis that you've described as being one of the structural issues that we have to contend with, and one of the protections that the tech giants enjoy and potentially exploit to their benefit, as do other people who ride on their platforms. But I think there is some leeway, or it has been put to us that there is some leeway to consider the issues of geography, national jurisdictions as a separate category of problems to be solved in a separate way. Not entirely, but that has been put before us, that we have been and can be presented a different set of views, filters, feeds, and this applies to a number of jurisdictions out there.
Yes.
So I would just like to, the reason I'm bringing this up is not to necessarily say that we should always agree with that, but I think for the purposes of the analysis going forward, we should separate out those two arguments and deal with them separately. One is, frankly speaking, the latter is, frankly speaking, an issue of how much resources people can be persuaded to put into the requisite technical solution. The first is about the legislative protections and how we should balance the various freedoms and concerns around the legislative protections. So my apologies for the interruption. I will let you carry on, but I just think that it would be useful if we separate out those two concepts.
Absolutely. No, I wasn't saying that regulation serves no purpose on a domestic level. I just said that we need to understand that it will have limited effect, unfortunately. And this is something which brings us back to the jurisdictional problem, to territoriality. It is true that in this country, for instance, you could apply regulatory efforts in terms of deliberate falsehoods, which would have a certain effect. But those who were really interested in accessing that sexy information, because that is probably the right word here, would simply get a VPN and would do it that way.
Maybe so.
We need to understand that it is a universal problem we're dealing with, from a jurisdictional point of view,
yes.
The jurisdictional clash or the territoriality clash is actually exemplified what's going on in the European Union right now. The French Data Protection Agency, CNIL, decided, pursuant to the right to be forgotten case, which you probably all know about from the 13th of May 2014, to levy a fine against Google in the amount of 100,000 euros for Google failing to take down content on a .com website, in other words, on a website in the US. The question was here whether the French regulatory authority had that right. And that authority knew very well that this would be challenged as a watcher, and it was challenged. It was brought before the Conseil d'État, which is the Supreme Court of Administrative Matters in France, and the Conseil d'État submitted that question to the European Court of Justice as a prejudicial question. Yes. That is, we are now awaiting the answer to that question. Now, the argument that was raised by Google was that it's actually not necessary to have global effect in order to obtain efficiency, because we can identify the IP address, we can geolocate the IP address within the territory in question. So yes, indeed, I'm not saying that it doesn't serve any purpose whatsoever, but even if you can identify the IP address within the territory, VPNs and other technology, which is very, very, very easy to download on your as an app. It's just a question of 10 seconds, and then you can access the .coms wherever you want.
Indeed. So, Mr. Shepard, I'm going to interrupt you again, because, and apologies for that, but because you have highlighted very articulately many of the challenges involved in regulating many of the problems thrown up by the structure of the internet today. The matter before us as a committee and in Singapore is very narrow in scope. We really want to only look at deliberate online falsehoods of a significant impact, both in terms of their virality and speed of spread, as well as the subject matter that may affect our social fabric. We are not out to solve the problems of the whole world with respect to the internet. So,
not today.
Not today, maybe for another day. Yes, indeed, those are the technical limitations for the extent to which some of the tools can be applied, but perhaps do not mean that we cannot solve or at least not solve, but address the specific scope of what we're trying to do in Singapore. If I could move you to another article, which is from the New Yorker, and again, this is now moving on from what is the problem, and here we have a suggestion, and the title of the article is How to Fix Facebook. You may or may not agree with the proposals by Adrian Chen, Nathan Heller, Andrew Marantz, and Anna Wiener. So it's 4 writers published on the 23rd of March. And I want to then firstly talk about some of the problems about how we might deal with this space. If I take you to the second or third paragraph, where Facebook has bristled at the suggestion that what Kogan and Cambridge Analytica did constitutes a breach, and then in quotes, people knowingly provided their information, no systems were infiltrated, and no passwords or sensitive pieces of information were stolen or hacked. And then a few paragraphs down, Adrian Chen, the paragraph starting, Zuckerberg's apology jumps between, but later on he says, I beg your pardon, the only thing that Zuckerberg offers here is harm reduction. And then the end of that paragraph, maybe Zuckerberg hopes that by laying out this narrative, he'll offer a picture of a technical loophole that has already been closed, but the human vulnerability is as present as ever. The only good news, it seems, is that it will be a little less violating next time. And then Anna Wiener goes on to say, it reads to me like a post-mortem for a software project run through the communications and legal departments. It's a gesture at transparency, but it's very slippery. And the issue here is there a defense that a consent-based process alone allows the tech giants then to abrogate all responsibility for what has happened thereafter? And there are plenty of precedents in the law that I'm sure you'll be familiar with that you can highlight to us. I clearly believe that it is not so. Secondly, are the measures that they're talking about with respect to harm reduction sufficient? as a way of covering the loophole that has been thrown up as a result. And thirdly, which is highlighted again in Anna Wiener's statement, Zuckerberg is pushing the narrative of bad actors who exploited a loophole. But if we can call it a loophole at all, then it is a policy loophole. Facebook was operating exactly as it was intended to. It was and is an ad network. So, those three questions. If we are going to think about the tech giants taking ownership of the problem or imposing some kind of regulatory requirement on them, and I realize there may be some geographical issues about that, we still haven't quite worked out what type of responsibility should we be asking them to take, and what type of regulatory intervention should we be considering?
As you mentioned before, the issue before us today is really that of deliberate falsehoods, this article is, of course, a consequence of a violation of data protection. It's not the same thing, okay. But it is the same thing in terms of accountability. I agree. But I just want to make that point. It's a very healthy consequence that we have now that Facebook and the other tech giants may wake up finally to the accountability issue, but it's not because of the deliberate falsehoods. It's because of the violation of data privacy. The facts in this particular case, from a legal point of view, is that Facebook may or may not have violated the consent decree with the FTC, which, if that is the case, would cause them to have to pay penalties up to $40,000 per violation, which is probably why people are selling their stock right now. But just to make it very clear that that is the specific problem we are dealing with right now. While I think that what should interest us is whether the business model as such makes it more or less impossible to deal with the problem of deliberate falsehoods. Yes, indeed, the business model. I referred to psychology before. There's no doubt that some of the best behavioral psychologists today are working for these companies and have developed techniques which cause us all to have Facebook accounts and so on and so forth, and to use them and find them more or less indispensable for everyday life, because they've done a great job in analyzing what makes us addicted. And of course, they've done that because of the advertising, retargeting capabilities inherent in that technology. The technology carries very many names. Bubbles and echo chambers, I think, are the names that are most commonly used. But that's not very new. I mean, in the 60s, we had what was called cluster technology, which was developed for radio and TV. And in those days, it had like maybe 100 different clusters or groups across the U.S. And today, I don't know how many echo chambers and bubbles there are. There are probably a few thousands, I don't know, because the algorithm is a very well-protected secret, which is another problem. So the business model as such seems to drive us towards having society divided into a lot of subsections, a lot of subgroups, which of course allows advertisers to retarget us on our newsfeed in a very efficient manner. So that's the business model in a simplified, quick way. Does that business model create a need for deliberate falsehoods? Or in other words, is it incompatible regulation against it? Well, I think that the business model itself, being to the extent that it's based on advertising, may actually find some sort of equilibrium if we also hold the advertisers accountable. Now, everybody has been focusing on the accountability of the of the tech providers, and I'm the first to stress the importance of that. But let's not forget that those that actually pay for this business model are the advertisers. And if there is a way of causing them maybe not to be accountable from a legal point of view, but from an ethical point of view and from a business point of view, meaning they'll simply lose business if they continue to advertise on these sites, well, maybe that's the best solution. The specific remedies that are suggested by Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook right now, again, they relate to data protection breach. And they may be useful, they may not be useful. I don't know exactly what they intend to do in terms of data protection. As I mentioned before, they will have to adapt to the European General Data Protection Regulation, which again takes effect on the 25th of May, and that would have had to do in any case. But of course, with the Cambridge Analytica case, there's even more drive to do that. But in terms of the deliberate falsehoods, I don't see any direct proposals dealing with that. And I think that the proposal that would be effective would be an algorithm which actually does exist today, but is not being used, which will allow the advertisers to have knowledge of the websites that contain false information or fake news, to use a term that is more of use. In the real-time bidding function, you can actually include a parameter which will allow the potential advertisers to have that information. And if it's made transparent that they had that information before they placed the ad, well, then advertising will become bad advertising. They will stop doing it.
So the outcome that you are trying to drive at through that process essentially is to demonetize the incentive to proliferate deliberate online falsehoods.
Yes.
Demonetize the websites or the players or the actors that profit from this process.
Yes, but demonetize. You see, there's another thing. We have to make a distinction here between websites and social media. The demonetization is completely different in those two areas.
But the outcome that you're striving for is the same.
The outcome will be the same, but it's much more complicated on social media.
Yes.
But the outcome would be the same, and it is possible, as I mentioned before, to include that in the real-time bidding function,
yes,
also on social media, but much more complicated.
So I think it's well beyond the remit of the committee to get down to the technical possibilities. I think we have to really establish what are the standards and principles we want to be guided by, and what are the types of solutions that we are willing to countenance together with the trade-offs and make the case later on as part of our output. And then ultimately the technical solutions, well, that's going to be beyond our capability, but we have to take them into account in terms of what's possible. But you would agree then that removing that financial incentive is key to the outcome that we want to achieve. And we would need some sort of regulatory pressure or regulatory lever on how to do that, and how it's done for a website versus social media, how it's done on the tech giants versus the advertisers. There would be technical limitations as well as sort of the operational limitations on that.
Yes, I mean, I was at a conference at the, actually I spoke at the Council of Europe last week, and there was a gentleman from the advertising industry in Europe who had this extremely interesting statistics showing, are we willing, we as users, to pay for the use of these social media? Today we pay without data, we all know that, but are we willing actually to pay $1 or whatever on a monthly basis, like we do for Napster and for these other music sites?
So that we become the user and not the product.
So that we become the user, not the product, and which would then deal also with the advertising, 100% reliance on advertising, and the business model would be different. And actually, the poll that was taken was that no, there's a large majority in Europe which would prefer the advertising model. Maybe that's not a great surprise. So we are in for the long run, probably, with the advertising model. But at least it is a question that had to be asked. And therefore, we need to see. We don't want to regulate and come up with proposals that are not technically possible.
Absolutely.
So we need to work together with these tech companies. That does not mean that we should not impose laws and regulations at the end of the day. But we need to find out what is technically possible and not. And I just happen to know that the algorithms like that do exist and that they are technically possible. I think there was also another question in what you said, which was, do we accept having these soft law approaches? I think that was what you were also implying, to tech companies. So far, they've been very good in achieving that. For instance, on hate speech, that is the agreement with the European Commission that they commit to policing hate speech, to trying to monitor hate speech, even applying artificial intelligence, which could also be done to deliberate falsehoods. But as we've seen in Germany with the law that took effect on the 1st of October, it is a law. It is not a soft law approach. And this is, as you all know, a law that contains a penalty of up to 50 million euros in case of a violation. In France, a law is also being discussed right now. It will not include most probably such penalties. But again, it's law. It's not soft law. It's hard, tough regulation. If I just make one remark about the German law and law in general, and I state that in my opening statement, the term deliberate falsehoods. Falsehoods is more generic than news, and that's why I like that term. On the other hand, I don't know whether I like the word deliberate, because it presupposes that it is deliberate. And if the regulation will apply only to falsehoods that are deliberate, the legal question we have to ask ourselves is deliberate on the side of whom? I mean, who is aware and who has intention? Who is deliberate? And what does that deliberate state of mind mean? Is it the author of the content in question who deliberately wants to mislead? Or what is deliberate intention actually? Or is it also the provider of the infrastructure, in this particular case, the social media platform? I think this is actually one of the main problems that we also have, that I personally have, with the German law, which tends to apply a standard of intent, or mens rea, as it were, which is based on complicity. In other words, and I apologize if this is getting too technical, but I think it's absolutely key if we want to regulate. We need to know what is the legal basis for holding social media accountable for hurtful content in general, posted by someone else, right? Because that is what it is. They don't post it themselves, right? So first of all, again, since we're talking about criminal law, we have to apply the standards of criminal law. And the basic standard of criminal law is that vicarious liability is an exception. I mean, I am not liable for whatever you may do, and you're not liable for whatever I may do. It is an exception. So under what circumstances may one company, in this particular case, this social media company, become liable from a criminal law point of view for content posted by a third party? Is it because they're complicit? And if it is a complicity standard, what is the mens rea requirement? Is it what we call in law dolus specialis, which means, do I, as Facebook, have to be deliberate in the sense that not only am I aware that the information is false, but I also have to associate myself with the intention of the perpetrator of the original crime, which is to destabilize or manipulate. Do I need to have the dolus specialis, which is associating myself with a purpose, or is it sufficient that I have awareness? Yeah. I'm sorry it was technical, but I think it's absolutely key if we want to regulate.
It is. Mr. Sheffield.
to understand this distinction.
It is key, it is technical, but it is important. But we're not there yet. We haven't actually got to the stage of crafting any laws. We're jumping the gun here. We have to scope out what are the types of interventions that we need. But your point is entirely valid, that if there is a legislative solution required, it needs to take these things into account.
Yes.
But that is not the point that we are at this point.
No, but I'm mentioning because of the German law that exists as being an example of a regulatory approach, which is not soft law.
I understand.
That my concern with the German law is precisely this.
I understand. So if I could maybe summarize the approach that I think, see if I've characterized your position correctly, that we do need to deal with this in a decisive, authoritative manner over the long term. We're not going to have a single measure that's going to work on its own. There's no single silver bullet, as it were. We would need a suite of options on the table, a suite of interventions customized to the platforms, the products, and the services where these deliberate online falsehoods are being perpetrated as well as spread. Some of those interventions would have to address the financial incentives that are out there for the platforms as well as for the advertisers. Presumably, we didn't go into this explicitly, but I think we can take it as read, is if there are legislative means, there needs to be some significant oversight over that legislative process. And we need to make sure that some degree of opportunity is presented for facts from an authoritative source to be presented to the public who are being exposed to or manipulated by these deliberate online falsehoods. I mean, that's the breadth of the sort of philosophical point of view that you would agree with, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is now let me also make another general statement, because I think that we're talking about philosophical point of view. Been working on this question of as let's call it fake news, because that's really what most people call it, for quite some time. And as I said before, one of the things that I think is most dangerous is this psychological research and the persuasion points. And I made the analogy to subliminal advertising. I would also like to introduce another notion here of something that I think is maybe just as dangerous as fake news, or more dangerous, which is what I call selective news. As we all know, again, I'm going back to the business model. Just to remind everybody that retargeting consists in the fact that certain individuals are deemed to be part of a certain echo chamber, and targeting the sale of a product to one echo chamber rather than another is more efficient, and therefore it's done to echo chamber A and not to echo chamber B. Fine. The consequence of that is also that we all have in this room different news feeds. I think that's very dangerous to democracy. We don't have the same news. Now, whether it's fake or not is not the point here. We don't have the same information. That's what I call selective news. I think that's just as dangerous to democracy as the fake news.
Mr. Sheffield, I think this is one of those large problems of the world that we can't solve.
No, well, actually, we can. Actually, we can. And I think it's easier to solve than the problem of the deliberate falsehoods. There was a very interesting proposal that came out from the Lord View Commission in December from Westminster, which proposed the introduction of a new offence, which is that of intimidation in public life. A very interesting report, really. It had to do with the assassination of Cox, as we all know, and the effect that that has had in the UK, but also in the rest of the world, of people simply not running for public office. They don't run for public office because they're being intimidated, they're being harassed, themselves and their family, with all kinds of fake news about them and their life in general. Now, one of the suggestions by the Law Review Commission was to create this offence, which would then apply during the pre-electoral period. My proposal would be to say, okay, why don't we say that, like, for 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it is, before some democratic event, which is typically election, either municipal or national elections, we would simply say that we would not allow selective news. It's not that hard to do. Actually, it's simply a question of suspending the echo chambers for 5 weeks before an election, so that everybody would have the same news. That, I think, is just as important as dealing with the fake news. And it's easier to do so because we don't run into terribly difficult legal and philosophical challenges of defining what fake news is. And we don't need the oversight that we do in terms of ex-post judicial oversight for the fake news. So selective news, to me, is probably just as dangerous or more dangerous than fake news. It's at the level of psychological manipulation, and there's an easy fix to that. In terms, just very quickly, in terms of the oversight, which is, of course, essential to any democratic governance, is remedies. The suggestion that I put on the table, which is now actually becoming probably it is a motion for recommendation. It'll probably become a recommendation for the Council of Europe, which is 47 countries, is not the European Union, is to create what is called an Internet Ombudsman. As we all know, the problem on the Internet is that if remedy is the normal judicial remedy, it'll take 1 or 5 years, including appeals, and the damage is done in 1 week or in 48 hours. So late justice is not only no justice, it's completely inefficient justice. So in terms of oversight, what we need here is an institution that will give guidance to the social media companies and the search engines and so on and so forth. And that can actually be done very, very quickly if that guidance is not a legally binding decision, but I stress the word guidance.
I understand.
So that judicial oversight could actually be almost real time and could counter the challenge that we have from the infrastructure providers, where they say, how do you want us to judge what is fake and not fake,
I understand.
licit or not licit? You have to take as government that obligation is not ours.
Yeah, but your larger point, Mr. Shefford, is that that process needs to be quick and almost real time, right? I mean, that should be the operating parameter. Again, we're not at the stage of thinking exactly what institution, what organization. We do have a number of options that have been presented before us. We will consider them. But the parameters under which that process should operate needs to be quick. And
Absolutely.
needs to have some degree of responsiveness for aggrieved persons and process of appeals and so forth.
That's right.
So that it needs to satisfy all the stakeholders in the ecosystem.
That's right.
Excellent.
Make one last remark, I think, because you're talking about the philosophical approach, because what we're actually doing here, let's not forget that, we as government, we have a monopoly on law enforcement. It's a constitutional monopoly.
Thank you.
And what we're doing is we are delegating that to the private sector.
Yeah.
And if we are delegating that to the private sector, simply because they're gatekeepers or maybe least cost avoiders or common carriers or public utilities or whatever we want to call them, we need to put in place a system which can give them the proper guidance to comply with the fact that we delegate to them.
Indeed. And we should then be requiring them to comply with that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shefford. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.